200 international experts from 40 countries gathered to the 5th Helsinki Chemicals Forum to discuss and exchange opinions on the promotion and development of global chemical safety and the related legislation. In addition to encountering 5 important topical issues chosen yearly by an international committee, the Helsinki Meet is the only policy-making forum of the global chemical industry. One of the topics is nanomaterials and the safety of the chemicals used in them.
The question is, can we use the old methods that we use for testing, assessment and management of chemicals, which we are used to for many decades now, can we use them for nanomaterials? And what has happened now is that the OECD and the EU both have had reports where they looked at the possibilities and they identified that in most cases the current methods can indeed be used, only in some cases they have to be adapted and some new methods have to be developed. But it's encouraging for the development of nanomaterials and for the progress with the sort of using these materials, that there is indeed now methods available to look at their safety. And we have to work further. Not all the questions are solved, but it looks like we have a basis on which we can build.
Another hot topic is the listing of chemicals of concern. How does this work globally and what is to come of it? In Europe, substances are identified primarily on their hazardous characteristics.
Within REACH, I think, compared to many other legislations, a very big difference with the rest of the world is that under REACH we've given the responsibility to industry to provide information on all the chemicals which they place on the market and produce and place on the market. So in a sense, let's say listing chemicals of concern is a second step, whereas in many other legislations, as far as I'm concerned or I'm aware of, this is for them actually the first step. So they look at the universe of chemicals, select chemicals, and from there on look at the assessments, and very often the authorities actually take care of the assessments. Whereas under REACH we've given the responsibility to industry. They have to do the assessments for all their chemicals, and then out of that big pool of information the authorities can take substances for which they want to zoom in and look more carefully what is happening. And that is, I think, a big, let's say, difference if you talk about systems worldwide between REACH and other legislations.
For example, I mentioned in Europe you identify substances primarily on the basis of their hazard characteristic. In my industry's view, substances' true priorities for regulation ought to be identified on the basis of risk, and we ought to be communicating that basis for identifying those substances to the public as well. So it's not just the fact that a substance poses a hazard, but does its use in a process or a product pose a real risk to health, for example? And if so, then what are we going to do about it? And for those systems to be effective, we need to be clear about what are the criteria for identifying these substances, for identifying these priority substances for action. We have to understand who's going to be prioritizing them, who's going to be providing the information to make those decisions, and then once we've identified them as priorities, what are we going to do about them? The Helsinki Chemicals Forum is essential in helping bring together policymakers to have some fundamental discussions about approaches that are viable, efficient, and effective. You know, here we don't have too many of these programs available now. Governments are resource constrained. Industry is also resource constrained. It's important that we make the most of our opportunities. The Helsinki Chemicals Forum is one of those important opportunities.
What is very important to me is that everyone is moving to the same standards and methods, so that ultimately we can start dividing the work. At the moment there is no real division of work. So in a way that every country has itself to identify which chemicals it wants to regulate, and if we would have common standards for hazards and risks and risk management, then we could start dividing the work, and we would ultimately be directly benefiting from work done elsewhere for our purpose as well.